Welcome to TinkerTalk, where game design meets player reality. Today, we're taking a deep dive into one of gaming's, well, absolute titans, Blizzard Entertainment. And specifically, we're looking at how a really profound internal cultural shift seems to have reshaped its flagship title, World of Warcraft. For years, Blizzard was seen as the gold standard, right? Known for that Blizzard polish. Their games just felt different. But then a series of pretty seismic events led to this major reckoning. It forced the company to really re-examine its whole identity. So our mission today is to unpack the critical moments that actually caused this change. We'll examine, how it's altered the game experience for millions of players, and explore the often very polarized reactions from World of Warcraft's massive, and let's be honest, passionate player base. We'll be drawing on investigative reports, company statements, and lots of really fascinating community discussions to try and get to the heart of what happened.
Yeah, it's a really compelling case study because what's striking, I think, is how directly an internal corporate culture can, show up in the actual content and design of a huge global product like World of Warcraft. We're not just talking minor tweaks here. We're looking at a situation where, leadership changes and intense public scrutiny forced this dramatic reevaluation of basic values. And that impacted everything from little character jokes right up to the big narrative themes and even the social rules of the game.
Okay, let's try and unpack this then. The story of World of Warcraft's shift, it really begins not with a bang, but more with this quiet, steady leaving of its original creators and leaders, the people who really defined what Blizzard was for decades. We saw huge figures like co-founder Mike Morhaime stepping down in 2018. Publicly, he said it was time for someone else to lead, but that was really just the start, wasn't it?
Well, absolutely. It wasn't just him. It was like a cascade, really. You had Chris Messin, the Warcraft architect, huge figure in the lore. He retired back in 2016. Tom Chilton, the World of Warcraft director, left the team that same year. Then later, Jeff Kaplan, director of Overwatch, huge hit. He quit suddenly in 2021. And Blizzard president J. Allen Brack resigned under pressure right in the middle of all the controversy. So this departure of just so many veteran leaders and creatives, it effectively ended that original era of Blizzard leadership. The visionaries. It created this noticeable vacuum at the top. There were even reports from inside saying they actually stopped sending company-wide emails announcing departures because, there were just too many.
Wow. Yeah, that paints a picture. So what does that actually mean for a company that was built on such a specific creative vision? These departures, they happened right around the time Activision's control over Blizzard was growing after the merger. And according to various reports, that brought pressure for, consistent growth, predictable results, which some argue fundamentally changed Blizzard's creative culture, its whole design ethos. You had journalists like Jason Schreier doing investigative work, noting that by maybe 2018 to 2020, Blizzard was, quote, clearly not the company it once was, struggling with reputational and institutional damage. And longtime employees were openly lamenting what they saw as the erosion of that distinctive developer-first culture. In fact, over 2,000 current and former staff actually signed an open letter in 2021 declaring they, quote, no longer trust the company's leaders. That's a clear sign of breakdown.
Right. And if you connect that to the bigger picture, this leaving of the old guard, it meant a huge shift away from what many players, and employees too, saw as that core Blizzard identity, that passion-driven, player-focused approach. It basically paved the way for new management, new corporate philosophies that, maybe prioritize metrics a bit more over creative freedom. It definitely raises a really important question, doesn't it? When the foundational creative minds, the architects of a company's soul, basically when they leave like that, can the company truly keep its original identity, its spirit? Or is it just bound to become something else entirely? It's a challenge lots of big creative companies face.
Okay, and here's where things get, really intense and frankly pretty disturbing. All those internal tensions, the cultural shifts brewing under the surface, they just exploded into public view in July 2021. With that bombshell lawsuit filed by California's Department of Fair Employment and Housing against Activision Blizzard, the suit alleged this toxic frat boy culture, widespread sexual harassment, gender discrimination, and the details were genuinely shocking. Allegations about a Blizzard employee who tragically took her own life after harassment, and that infamous Cosby Suite incident referring to a hotel room where alleged misconduct happened. Just incredibly serious accusations.
Yeah, and the initial corporate response, it was widely seen as defensive, maybe even tone-deaf, which only made the crisis worse and directly led to an employee walkout, very public walkout. But the pressure, both public and internal, was immense. And it did prompt a shift, though maybe not immediately. Within days, the president at the time, J. Allen Brack, called the reported behavior completely unacceptable. Even former leaders like Morhaime and Metzen issued public apologies, saying they failed to prevent that kind of culture. And in the immediate aftermath, Dozens of employees were fired or disciplined. High-profile developers named in the allegations, like World of Warcraft's creative director Alex Afrasiabi, were ousted. And it was so urgent they were even hastily renaming in-game characters named after these people, or just scrubbing their presence entirely. A very visible attempt to, distance the company from the allegations.
Right. Then Blizzard leadership publicly promised to rebuild trust, to fundamentally reinvent the workplace culture. They brought in a new co-lead, Jen O'Neill, the first woman to head the studio, which was notable, although she herself resigned later, citing unequal pay, which just added another layer of controversy. But they did implement mandatory anti-harassment training, launched new diversity and inclusion programs, brought in third-party auditors. For you, what really stood out about the player response during all this? It must have been huge.
Well, it was massive. The gaming community was really grappling with how to react. This was a company many had, admired for years. You saw players staging very visible in-game protests. You saw boycotts being organized. And a lot of players just quit World of Warcraft, just walked away in disgust. Mid-2021 definitely saw a significant player drop-off. And notably, Blizzard's big MMORPG rival, Final Fantasy XIV, hit record player counts. They openly talked about the influx of World of Warcraft refugees, influencers, veteran players they were migrating over. Blizzard's reputation, once almost untouchable, took the severe hit. So much so that when Microsoft announced the acquisition of Activision Blizzard in 2022 for that staggering $69 billion, many people, including industry analysts, saw it not just as a business move, but partly as an attempt to sort of rehabilitate a disgraced game maker, to try and restore some trust, which really makes you ask, when a company takes such a public, profound hit to its reputation, can it truly rebuild that image? And what's the cost to its original identity, the brand people knew?
So, with this huge internal push for cultural reform, and under all the scrutiny, Blizzard also started this broad cleanup of World of Warcraft's content itself. Developers actually stated in July 2021 that the game would explicitly remove inappropriate references to, quote, better reflect shared values. And like you said, this went way beyond just renaming a couple of NPCs.
Well, yeah, way beyond.
Yeah.
What's really interesting is just how deep this sort of cleansing went into the game's actual fabric.
Yeah.
It wasn't superficial at all. Lots of long-standing jokes, character voice lines, even those little flavor texts describing items or locations, many were edited or just cut out completely. For instance, patch 9.1.5 for the Shadowlands expansion, it removed a whole load of the game's kind of silly or flirty emotes, stuff that had sexual innuendo or maybe just crass humor. Lines like that famous one, "Is that a man worm in your pocket, or are you just happy to see me?" Or "Ever ridden a rocket before? Mine's huge." Things like that. Fan sites like Icy Veins actually cataloged dozens of these removals. It confirmed it was part of this larger company-wide effort of updating outdated and inappropriate references.
And they even changed artwork. That feels very visible.
Yeah, definitely. That in-game painting, one of the reclining women in revealing clothes that had been in an old tavern for ages, suddenly replaced with a painting of a bowl of fruit.
A bowl of fruit, right.
Yeah. Another portrait of a woman was updated to look more modest. An editor at MMORPG.com summarized it pretty well, saying the updates targeted old, tasteless, and sometimes discriminatory jokes and aimed to make World of Warcraft's content more inclusive.
Even the term greenskin, which was, long-standing slang for orcs, often seen as derogatory, was largely removed from the game text, reflecting a move away from potentially racial undertones.
And it wasn't just flavored text or art. They revisited older quests and even some core lore elements. There was a quest in the Undercity involving characters Teresa and Gerard Abernathy. It was rewritten significantly to remove implications of non-consensual experimentation, and the NPC Finkel Einhorn. That name was a direct reference to an Ace Ventura movie gag from the 90s, which is now pretty widely seen as transphobic. So that character got renamed. The whole design philosophy clearly shifted, didn't it? From maybe a Wild West, anything goes humor, to something much more deliberate, focused on inclusivity.
And beyond just changing old stuff, they introduced something new. The social contract in mid-2022. This wasn't optional, right? It was a mandatory pop-up agreement for everyone logging in. Spelled out expectations for respectful behavior, asking players to be welcoming, avoid harassment, hate speech, bullying. Supporters saw it as overdue, a necessary step for a better environment. But it definitely sparked a lot of debate, too. Some players really didn't like the feeling of forced politeness, felt like they were being lectured, while others welcomed the clear stance against trolls and toxic behavior. It created a real tension.
Absolutely. And the social contract, plus all these content changes, it really pushes forward an important question. How much should a game studio step in, intervene in player interactions, change established game content? And at what point does that kind of cleaning house risk removing the distinctive flavor, the edge, the specific tone that maybe drew a lot of players in originally? Does it risk alienating a big chunk of your long-term fans?
Yeah, and maybe the most, let's say, contentious part of World of Warcraft's recent evolution, especially for the veterans, has been this perceived shift in the narrative tone. Many longtime players feel the storytelling has become noticeably more optimistic, maybe more family-friendly, and some critics use the word Disneyfied.
Right, and it's interesting to see that contrast they point out.
Yeah.
You see critics on the official forums complaining, saying things like, it feels way too much like a Disney movie, Disneyfied cartoon where everyone wants to be best friends. They argue the writing lost its tonal diversity. It became too cautious, too polished. Modern villains, they'll say, feel kind of bloodless or cartoonish compared to the old lore. I mean, remember the Plague of Undeath, the atrocities Arthas committed, or Garrosh. Real moral complexity, real darkness. These players feel modern World of Warcraft kind of shies away from showing the actual horrors of war directly. It sanitizes the grim stuff that used to define Azeroth.
But on the other side of that coin, lots of players genuinely welcomed this change in tone. And that's important too. After Legion, Battle for Azeroth, Shadowlands, those were back-to-back world-ending, often quite bleak narratives. So the Dragonflight expansion in 2022 felt like a real breath of fresh air for many. Its story was more focused on exploration, legacy, rebuilding. It had this almost hopeful vibe. And the developers themselves basically said Dragonflight was intentionally designed to feel more grounded, more uplifting. A return to Azeroth's familiar skies after all the doom and gloom of Shadowlands. And that allowed for more lighthearted slice-of-life stories too, like learning about centaur traditions or Tuskar fishing. Some found that a really nice change of pace.
So it creates this real challenge for the development team, doesn't it? It raises that question. Can World of Warcraft actually find a balance between its gritty, mature roots and this newer, more inclusive, maybe more uplifting narrative style? Or is it just destined to please one part of the audience while inevitably alienating another, perhaps more traditional group? The game's identity feels like it's really at a crossroads there.
And another big feature of Blizzard's post-2020 design approach is this really strong public emphasis on diversity and representation. The company has explicitly stated its commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DE&I, and you can increasingly see that reflected in World of Warcraft's characters and its storylines.
Yeah, there's been a clear effort to put women even more into the spotlight, narratively speaking. Now, Warcraft's always had strong female characters, right? Jaina Proudmoore, Sylvanas Windrunner, but recent expansions have really featured them heavily. Battle for Azeroth was pretty much marketed around that Sylvanas versus Jaina dynamic. Dragonflight's main key art had Alex Strasza right there, the face of the expansion. And even the new lore introduced things like matriarchal centaur clans led by female khans. Developers have also talked openly about having a diverse team behind the scenes and how that brings different points of view into the content itself. It's a very conscious shift.
But that approach, specifically how they've implemented representation, hasn't gone without criticism from players. There was a pretty notable Reddit lore discussion titled Rise of the Poorly Written Daughters. It critiqued what the poster saw as a trend. Lots of legendary male characters suddenly having previously unknown daughters who step into the story. Like Tyrion Fordring's daughter, Talia, and Bolvar Fordragon's daughter, also named Talia.
Right.
And the argument wasn't against female representation itself, but that the execution felt, well, tokenistic sometimes. That these new heroines were often written as almost perfectly virtuous, maybe a bit interchangeable, lacking the complex struggles or moral gray areas of older characters, male or female, like Garrosh or even Raytheon. So the critique suggests Blizzard might be playing it too safe, maybe afraid of portraying women with flaws to avoid controversy, leading to less interesting characters for some.
And beyond the big narrative figures, World of Warcraft also significantly expanded character customization options for inclusivity. Late 2020 saw new skin tones, face shapes, hairstyles, jewelry, letting players create characters that better reflected their own backgrounds. Dragonflight went further, letting players pick any face for any body type for some races, kind of decoupling gendered appearance from physics. And there have been requests from the community for even more gender-fluid options, like non-binary identity choices. Some players have expressed real appreciation for even small steps in representation, feeling it makes Azeroth more welcoming for them.
But again, these suggestions have had a very mixed reception from the player base overall. While many are supportive, you definitely see a vocal minority reacting negatively to bringing overt gender or sexuality topics into a fantasy setting, sometimes accusing people asking for it of trolling or just dismissing it as unnecessary in a fantasy game that should be about escaping reality. Discussion threads on these topics often get really heated, devolve into personal attacks, and frequently end up locked by moderators. It just illustrates how polarized the community is on these specific issues.
Yeah, it's a complex situation, and it raises a really crucial question for any long-running fantasy world like World of Warcraft. When you try to introduce more modern social concepts like diverse gender identity or sexuality into this established setting, how do you navigate the expectations of your long-term player base versus the desires and needs of newer players or underrepresented groups? This is a very delicate balancing act, and there are no easy answers, really. The supporters often argued that Blizzard is, well, just catching up with the times. That removing sexist or juvenile content makes World of Warcraft more respectful, more welcoming, without actually harming anything important. A lot of players, frankly, probably didn't even notice some of the old flirt jokes being removed. They saw them as relics of a 2004 mindset, maybe out of place now. They point out that toxic behavior did drive people away historically. And so efforts like the social contract are seen as welcome reminders to just, play nice, respect other players. There was one blogger who put it quite sharply, saying the anti-woke crowd seemed upset mainly at being asked to think about the people they play with as fellow humans, which supporters feel says more about those critics than about Blizzard's changes.
But on the other side, the critics are incredibly vocal that something valuable has been lost. A really common theme you hear is that Blizzard is just engaged in, performative corporate virtue signaling, changing superficial things without fixing underlying problems. For instance, some players cynically noted that changing that painting of a woman into a fruit bowl, well, it doesn't actually fix workplace harassment. It just, quote, turns women into fruit. They see it as a shallow gesture. The phrase, Blizzard has neutered World of Warcraft, popped up a lot on forums, with complaints that the game's edge, its gritty war themes, its sometimes dark humor have all been diluted, sanitized, made bland. Removing the spit mote, which was a long-standing, if sometimes misused, player interaction, and the mandatory social contract. Some saw that as Big Brother Blizzard policing how players talk to each other, treating everyone like criminals in waiting. Some content creators even adopted that slogan, get woke, go broke, to show their strong disapproval.
Yeah, what's really important to grasp here, I think, is that not all the detractors are automatically reactionary or against any change. Many are simply longtime fans who feel disoriented, maybe even disheartened, by the changes to a game they've loved for years, sometimes decades. They remember Warcraft as this dark, often satirical, morally complex universe, and seeing it get scrubbed clean of its rough edges feels to them like a betrayal of the franchise's roots, its original identity. The whole debate often gets framed as this clash, old school versus new school views on what World of Warcraft should even be. I saw one forum poster really lamenting the change, feeling World of Warcraft used to have this darker, more depressing yet beautiful tone, and now it's just like a cartoon. Completely different vibe.
Which brings us back to that fundamental challenge for any really long-running, beloved franchise, doesn't it? When a game is as old and has as much history as World of Warcraft, how can it evolve with modern sensibilities, with changing societal expectations, without completely alienating the core fans who were there from the start, who defined its success and stayed loyal for so long? It's a real tightrope walk.
Absolutely. And these shifts, the cultural changes, the design changes, plus the huge impact of the 2021 lawsuit, they undeniably affected the player base and Blizzard's reputation. Back in 2021, when the lawsuit news really broke, community sentiment towards Blizzard just plummeted. You saw hashtags like #ActiveBlizzWalkout, #BoycottBlizzard trending everywhere. World of Warcraft's active player numbers took a noticeable dip, and there was that very tangible migration we talked about. Final Fantasy XIV gained so many players coming from World of Warcraft that they literally ran out of digital keys for a while. Even major World of Warcraft community figures, people usually very supportive, publicly criticized Blizzard, that was rare and really impactful.
Over time, some of that initial intense anger subsided, as it tends to do, but Blizzard's public trust, which was once almost legendary in the industry, it remains fundamentally damaged, I think it's fair to say. A Bloomberg report in 2022 summed it up pretty starkly. Quote today, Blizzard is clearly not the company it once was. Every move they make now seems to be watched with this intense scrutiny, maybe even skepticism from a large part of their audience. You saw it when Chris Metzen, one of those original creative voices, returned as a creative advisor for Warcraft late in 2022. A lot of fans cheered so enthusiastically. They saw it as this desperate, maybe, but hopeful sign that Blizzard might try to restore some of that old Blizzard magic, which just underlines how much value that original goodwill and creative vision held for the players.
Definitely. And in terms of the actual in-game community, the day-to-day experience, it really seems like a mixed bag. Different people report different things. Anecdotally, you hear many players saying the average environment has improved. Fewer casual slurs or derogatory jokes in public chat. Maybe harassment reporting feels more responsive. The social contract was part of that broader push. And Blizzard did report an uptick in positive behavior reports, suggesting maybe their efforts are having some effect. And another measurable outcome seems to be that the demographics are slowly broadening. More women playing than maybe a decade ago. Guilds for LGBTQ+ players are thriving, finding a more welcoming space.
But it's also really important to remember, isn't it, that World of Warcraft's subscription numbers, they tend to rise and fall mostly based on content quality. Like, how good is the latest expansion? Is there enough to do? For example, the general underperformance and widespread player unhappiness with the Shadowlands expansion, that hurt player numbers way more profoundly than removing any specific joke ever did. Then Dragonflight comes along, is generally seen as solid, fun, engaging,
Yeah.
and the population stabilizes again.
Right, which leads to this complex interplay of factors. And it raises a really critical ongoing question. If the quality of the actual game content is still the main thing driving player engagement and keeping people subscribed, then how much does the company's public image, its internal culture, or even its efforts at inclusivity ultimately impact its long-term success, its ability to hold on to that loyal player base? It's hard to measure precisely.
So, as we've examined Blizzard's really profound internal cultural shift and how that rippled out into World of Warcraft, it paints this complex, really fascinating picture. The departure of those founding icons, the shock of the 2021 lawsuit, it truly marked the start of a new era. One where the company is, well, very aggressively trying to reform itself, purging older, maybe offensive material, promoting inclusivity, projecting a more progressive image. And in World of Warcraft, that directly translated to things like renamed NPCs, removed jokes, adjusted art, more female and minority characters pushed forward, and systems like the social contract, all designed explicitly to try and foster a friendlier, more welcoming community.
And these changes, they have had tangible benefits for many players. A more welcoming atmosphere for a broader group, potentially. Storylines that maybe a wider audience can connect with. But at the same time, there's been significant pushback. Detractors who feel Blizzard has fundamentally sanitized the soul of Warcraft, potentially alienating those core fans who fell in love with its originally unapologetic, sometimes mature themes, its darker humor. The community response is just deeply divided, often breaking down along ideological lines about what people even want World of Warcraft to be in the 2020s.
Yeah, like that frustrated player on the forum asking, kind of lamenting, what happened to the war in Warcraft? There ain't no war in it, no more. All the quests boil down to friendship. But then in direct contrast, you have another commenter writing, I'm proud Blizzard is finally moving towards themes of hope and redemption. Most of us are over 30. We don't need edge for its own sake. So Blizzard is now performing this incredibly difficult balancing act, aren't they? Trying to keep evolving with modern sensibilities, modern expectations, without losing that core fantasy, that sense of adventure, and yes, the war that makes Warcraft, well, Warcraft.
Exactly. And this ongoing evolution, it raises a final kind of provocative question for everyone listening to think about. As the world of Warcraft continues to reflect the changing values and priorities of its creators, what will the ultimate shape of Azeroth's tapestry be? Can it actually weave together all these disparate threads, the old, the new, the gritty, the hopeful, into a coherent, compelling whole that satisfies enough people?
Thanks for listening to TinkerTalk. Until next time.